Okay, Sally, last week we talked briefly about staggered starts. Can you elaborate on how you see teams starting workouts on the 15th with pods and staggered start times?
First off, welcome, Tyler. JP is not here today, so Tyler's filling in, and so thank you for that. Staggered starts. That's one thing that our coaches need to make sure that they do. We cannot have quote-unquote mass gatherings, and we cannot congregate at one time. So when coaches are having multiple pods going, I know there's some football coaches that may have 5 pods on the football field and then 3 pods on another field. I mean, that's 8 pods. And if you have 5, that's 40 kids. That's too many to come to the facility at one time. So we're asking, please stagger those start and end times and make sure you tell your kids, you get there, you get to your pod, and then you leave. So the staggered times are very, very crucial when you have multiple pods.
The guidelines say a coach can't move from one pod to another during a workout. What about the kids? Can they change pods?
Now the kids cannot change pods. Once they have a pod, they need to stay there. And the reason being is we need to limit the amount of kids that an athlete, is exposed to. So for example, if we have one kid and he's around 4 other kids and a coach, then if something happens, if COVID-19 comes in and something happens, that the pandemic is just isolated. You know, we don't have that kid going to multiple pods, and there's a lot of kids that now have been exposed by the one kid. So that is the reasoning for keeping kids in the same pod so that they're with the same kids all the time.
In our last interview session, you said the COVID-19 test for coaches must be within 72 hours of the start date. What's changed about that?
You know, and that has changed. So right when we did our Q&A last Monday, I was getting some calls and saying 72 hours in our community is taking 5, 6, 7 days to get those test results back. So I did reach out to the governor's office, and sure enough, in many communities, it is taking longer than 72 hours. So what we are now saying is take the COVID test as close to the start date as possible within your community. You should know in your community how long it's taking to get those tests back. There are some communities that are bringing somebody in to test all coaches. That is fine. So just make sure that it's close to a start date. So if you did take one in April and we're starting June 15th, you do need to take another one.
The governor has directed that the vulnerable are still under the stay-at-home order. If a coach or an athlete is vulnerable, can they still participate in summer workouts?
Yeah, and I received that question, especially with coaches that might be in the vulnerable category, but they would like to coach. And so I'm going to put it back on the school. If you feel that coach is wanting to come to practice, is able to come to practice, and there's no liability concerns, then that will be a school decision whether those vulnerable coaches or athletes are able to participate.
Are there guidelines on how to clean and sanitize equipment like basketballs for each individual?
You know, there are guidelines, and I'm still working on that. So I plan to have a document out to our athletic directors as to, you know, alcohol wipes are not good for volleyballs, and there's some parts, it's a solution between water and alcohol, and we'll have those guidelines out to help the schools. Especially when we start using the equipment, we're going to need to make sure that they're sanitized properly. So we will help the schools and get those guidelines for them.
What kind of guidelines are in place for things like filling up water bottles during workouts?
You know, one thing that you got to be really prepared for is not having a water fountain and kids coming to the water fountain. You know, that means they're touching it, their mouth is touching it. So each kid should have their own water bottle. When we first did the guidelines, we knew that a water bottle was not sufficient enough water. In fact, I put in there, sent to the State Department, a gallon. You know, a kid needs to bring a gallon, but that's not realistic. So my suggestion to you is every kid has their own water bottle, and then if they need to refill it, to fill up the water bottle, wipe down the place where he touched, and have the kids go ahead and fill up the water bottle their own self. But as far as running out of water, we need to make sure all these kids have water. It is hot out there, and so you do need to make sure that there's a place where they can go to fill up the water bottles.
Since the NMAA is regulating summer activities, are the coaches limited to 7.5 hours per week as is done in the off season?
No, they're not. We haven't talked about 7.5 hours. So whatever is decided at the school level, remember, I've always said these are guidelines, and the schools need to work within those guidelines. And there is nothing about how many hours they can practice or what they can do. So that's a school decision. There are a lot of schools that may do fall sports. There are a lot of schools that may do the winter and spring sports now and then bring the fall in July. Again, that's a school decision, and you don't need to worry about how many hours you have contact with your kids.
We've talked about athletic teams and guidelines for their workouts, but what about groups like marching band or JROTC? What sort of guidelines do they follow?
And they've reached out, the junior ROTC and the marching band has reached out to, for guidance. And we do not regulate marching band, but they are part of the school environment. And so they need to follow the same guidelines that we do with equipment, pods, 6 feet distance. So I would suggest that marching band and junior ROTC, especially junior ROTC because we do govern them, take the guidelines and work within those guidelines, and they too can begin, working with their kids as well.
We've set up these guidelines for the summer workouts. We've also heard some people refer to this as open gym. What's the difference between the two, if any?
This weekend I saw some posts that said volleyball open gym beginning June 15th, and it was a concern because open gym is a free-for-all. And coaches need to really make sure that they know who is showing up to the gym, when they're showing up to the gym, and that they are put in pods and there's some guidance. And remember, if there's 3 pods, there needs to be 3 coaches. And so when you say open gym, you don't know who's showing up. So coaches, I suggest what you do is reach out if they're the 9th graders, the incoming 9th graders or 8th graders, and reach out to them and make sure you know who is showing up. And before they get there, you already have it organized as to what kid is going in what pod. We cannot have kids come to the gym and stand in a group and wait for a coach to say, go to this pod, go to that pod, go to that pod. Coaches, you need to make sure you're organized and you have it ready. You have, especially like volleyball, you have only 3 in the main gym. You have 15 kids there at once. When you say open gym, it could be 30, 40, 50 kids showing up, and then what do? So you cannot just say it's open gym. It really needs to be organized.
The NMAA released the summer guidelines on May 28th. So do you foresee any changes with those guidelines before June 15th date?
I do. The last press conference that the governor had, she opened up gyms 50% capacity. And the first thing I did is I reached back out to the Secretary of Education and the governor's office and said, if gyms are at 50% capacity, what about high school gyms? And in some communities, that's the gym for the community. And so I am working at that at this time with the weight rooms, being able to go in there, whether that's June 15th or the latest June 22nd, to be able to access the weight rooms. Also working on the equipment, the balls especially. If I can show the governor's office that we sanitize correctly, can we use equipment after sanitizing? Because they're going to have to do that in the weight room too. So we just need to make sure that we do this correctly. And so I am working on that. So by June 15, there could be changes. At this time, though, we're still 5-1. Until I hear that we can get in groups of 10, we're still 5-1 on June 15th. But the other changes may come, and I'll work with the athletic directors and let them know.
Lastly, Sally, we are 1 week away from the start of the summer workouts. What are you hearing from athletic directors or coaches about getting prepared to begin?
It's been tough. I think that when they saw the guidelines, they're excited, but there are a lot of restrictions. The thermometer checks, the sanitation, making sure they're in pods, how many pods, and I know it's like frustrating, and I know that people just want to get going. But as I've been saying from the beginning, baby steps. If we do it right now, then we're going to be able to play in August. If we don't do it right now and show that we can't do this in a very good, clean, safe environment, then we're not going to be able to play in August. And so I know there's frustration out there because there are club teams, there are other groups, there are parents taking, 7, 8 kids, equipment out, doing things on their own. I can't control parents, and I cannot control the club world. But all I can do is what I can say to you is you can control your parents, and you can control what your athletes are doing. And so we need to make sure that we do this correctly. And I'm not saying people are doing it wrong. There's a lot of people that are following these guidelines to a T. But then yesterday I got an email of a club softball tournament here in the metro area at Alameda Little League. And so it's like, coaches are frustrated. Why is this going on when it doesn't even follow the governor's orders? We cannot worry about what anybody else is doing. We need to worry about what education-based athletics is doing, because ultimately when school begins, and if we show them what we can do this summer, it's going to help them realize that school can begin. And when school begins, we're going to be able to play this fall. But so the frustration level, just make sure that you realize that it's goals. We set small goals. We always have our long-term goals, and our long-term goal right now is to play fall sports. We need to look at it daily, that these are the short-term goals, and if we do the short-term goals correctly, then we are going to play again, and that's our long-term goal.